Hi there, thank you for tuning in to this latest instalment of the On Philosophy digital lecture series organised by The Philosopher, which is the UK's longest running public philosophy journal. My name's Anthony Morgan, I edit the journal. And as some of you will know, this is the final event in a week of 5 daily events to coincide with the publication of our new issue on What Is We. So the fifth consecutive day of me hawking my wares like a sort of Dale Carnegie character, but you know, such is life in the absence of a multimillionaire Brexit supporting philanthropist as benefactor. So please consider buying a copy of the issue. It has a wonderful opening essay or lead essay from Dan Zahavi, who's one of the speakers who I will be introducing shortly. And Luna Dolezal, who will be Dan's interlocutor for the evening, contributed a super essay to the previous issue of The Philosopher, which in fact we uploaded today. I'll put links to Dan and Luna's homepages, Twitter pages, and anything else in the chat function. So to turn to the event itself, I'm really delighted that Dan and Luna can join us. Phenomenology is has a very sort of special place in my heart. When I was studying for a master's, it was the area that I was most interested in. In fact, I went on several occasions to Dan's extraordinarily well-funded and luxurious institute in Copenhagen, the Center for Subjectivity Research, for summer schools, conferences, and a lot of extremely invigorating philosophical discussions. So just to introduce our two speakers, Dan Zahavi is the director of the Center for Subjectivity Research in Copenhagen. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Copenhagen and more recently at the University of Oxford. His work is at the interface of phenomenology and philosophy of mind, especially looking at intersecting empirical sciences such as psychology and psychiatry. His books include The Phenomenological Mind, co-authored with Sean Gallagher, as well as, I've got a couple more written down, Husserl's Phenomenology, because Dan is primarily a Husserl scholar, and Self and Other, Exploring Subjectivity, Empathy and Shame. Dan's work has been translated into more than 30 languages. Dan is joined this evening by Luna Dolezal, who's assistant professor in philosophy and medical humanities at the University of Exeter, which is one of the UK's main phenomenology hubs, which is great. Her research is in areas, especially the phenomenology of embodiment, philosophy of medicine, and medical humanities. Her authored books include The Body and Shame, Phenomenology, Feminism, and the Socially Shaped Body, and more recently she co-edited the collection New Feminist Perspectives on Embodiment. So in line with the theme of the issue on What Is We, and also in line with Dan's latest grant, which is a research project that started this year called Who Are We? The focus is going to be on the primacy of we, the relationship between self and other, and no doubt there will be many more topics discussed in the conversation. So Dan and Luna will come on screen in a second and start their conversation. They'll probably speak for about half an hour, at which point we will open up for questions. So please introduce yourself via the chat function. Tell us where you're from. If you know anything about phenomenology, for example, if you have any thoughts. If you want a question asked, please send it to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I think that's probably about it for housekeeping. So welcome to Dan and Luna, and thank you all very much for turning up today.
Great, thank you, Anthony, for that introduction. And it's really nice to be here with Dan. I was supposed to come to Copenhagen or go to Copenhagen in September for a research visit, and unfortunately that wasn't possible. So it's nice for us to be able to have this conversation online in place of that. So it's nice to see you, Dan.
Yeah, same to you, of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a lot of overlapping research interests, considering intercorporeality, self-other relations, shame, sociality. And so I'm really interested in your current research project looking at the status of the we and the relation to the I. And I thought, just to start out, maybe for those in the audience who maybe aren't trained philosophers or academic philosophers, we could talk about some of the basic concepts. So one of the basic concepts is collective intentionality. Could you tell us what you mean by that, or what is generally meant by that in philosophy?
Yeah, of course. So I think perhaps, I mean, a starting point could be individual intentionality. So what would be examples of that? I can perceive a tree, I can remember a summer vacation, I can love somebody, I can feel ashamed about something. Of course, I can also act on my own. I can move a chair or bake a cake. And the point is then that intentionality can also come in a collective form. I mean, we can make food together. We can move a furniture together. A couple of parents might love their daughter. They might also perhaps feel ashamed of how they have treated her. So there are many instances of both shared emotions, shared experiences, shared actions that I think we can find around in everyday life, and that's what is typically meant by collective intentionality.
And so the idea is that if we have a collective intentional experience, then we are somehow constituted as a we, a group subject. And I think the title of this event is the Primacy of the We, and I think that maybe understanding how the primacy of the we could be perhaps contrasted with the primacy of the I might be useful as well. So what is philosophically at stake when you say that there's primacy to the we?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, just an initial remark, which might not have been super clear from this headline, the primacy of the we. I mean, it was actually intended as a question rather than as a statement. And just to put the cards on the table, I mean, my answer to that question will be negative. So, but we might return to that later on. Yeah. So I think, I mean, when talking about the primacy of the we, I think it might make sense to distinguish a more narrow from a slightly more lax presentation of this proposal. And so in the narrow sense, I mean, one idea could be that collective intentionality actually takes precedence. The claim could be that individual action is actually the exception rather than the rule. It's something we have to learn, departing from collective action, from actions that we are doing with others. So this would be one, I think, specific way of understanding it. Likewise, one might claim that our separateness, that it's our separateness that is somehow in need of an explanation rather than our togetherness. And for instance, in psychoanalytic literature, one can occasionally find the claim that the infant is initially incapable of distinguishing itself from the caregiver, that it initially exists in a state of undifferentiation. And so, on such an account, one might perhaps say that initially the infant is part of an undifferentiated we, not yet decomposable into I and you. So I think this would be the narrow, take on what the primacy of the we might amount to. But I think it might perhaps also, and perhaps this is actually a more common view, one might also speak of it in a more lax sense, where basically the claim would be that the I or the self is communally grounded. One might, for instance, say that first we experience ourselves as part of a family or tribe or group. We partake in its way of life, and this precedes our development of our own individuality, the development of our own distinct perspective on the world. So I think this is probably a much more kind of commonsensical way of talking about it. And the opposite view, or the competing claim, is obviously that a we understood as a particular form of being with others presupposes a plurality of individual minds, and that the individual mind to that extent must have some kind of primacy. perhaps another way of putting it is to say that the we understood as a first person plural requires some kind of differentiation, and that it for that very reason is something of a confusion to claim that the we is a form of undifferentiated oneness.
Yeah, so I was sort of thinking the same thing, that the example of early infancy and child development maybe doesn't pertain because that early or that young infant doesn't have a sense of the first person plural. So they don't seem to be competing claims that we all come from community and necessarily are in an undifferentiated sociality in early infancy. But that's quite a different claim from saying that we can have a sense of group identity and a sense of a plural first person plural perspective, right?
From the outset.
Yeah.
No, I agree. But I think also, I mean, perhaps one way to also to kind of push the discussion forward is that and I think this would really be one of my main claims, that if we want to be if we want to understand the notion of the we better, I think it's really of paramount importance to get clearer on what exactly we mean by a self. What do we mean by individuality? And I think one of my concerns is that many of the contributors to the contemporary discussion of collective intentionality do not really engage with these kinds of claims. And I think that's a kind of lacuna that I think has to be somehow filled.
And do you think that your previous work on, say, the minimal self will fill that lacuna in terms of how you're thinking about the we position?
Well, so I mean, so I do think that work is kind of, I mean, at least it forms my own way of engaging with the problem of the we. I mean, it would be hard to claim anything else. And so again, to kind of try to make it clearer also to people who might not be so familiar with this discussion. I mean, when discussing the question of what has primacy, I think the plausibility of the claim that community has some kind of primacy, I mean, that claim might make a lot of sense if we operate with a certain notion of self. So, I mean, if we by selfhood and if we by individual identity primarily think about, you know, what defines us as person, what is it that matters to us, what do we care about, which norms and values and preferences do we have. And I think it makes a lot of sense to think about our identity in terms of those notions. I mean, if that is what we mean, then I think it makes a lot of sense to claim that all of those things are to a large extent formed and shaped and enabled by our community membership, and to assume that we somehow had a very fixed grasp of what matters to us and what preferences we have independently of some kind of social interaction. I mean, doesn't really strike me as making a lot of sense. But that's of course one conception of what a self amounts to, and I think, I mean, one might contrast that with this more minimal take that I have defended, where I think it makes sense to talk about a self primarily when looking at the structure of experience, when thinking about the fact that experiences are not just anonymous, unowned events. Experiences are somebody's experiences. And I think if that's what we have in mind when we talk about selfhood, I mean, this fundamental subjective component of experience, I have a much harder time kind of making sense of the claim that should be socially constituted, or that we would only come to possess subjective experiences as a result of communal membership. I mean, I don't really understand how that argument is supposed to run. So the whole point here is that I think in order to make headway, I mean, it's so important to disentangle different notions of self and be very clear about what exactly one has in mind.
But I suppose that claim brings me back to the early infancy, because it might be that there's no clear way to talk about how experience in this minimal sense is constituted by interactions with others, but surely, like, interactions with others and caregivers who ensure survival are, we could say, the condition for the possibility of experience, right? So there's no infant who's going to survive to the point of self-conscious experience without a host of caregivers, or at least one caregiver who will bring them to that point. So is it really a philosophical question then? if it's sort of a thought experiment that maybe we could strip back all the social experiences?
No, I mean, I just think that it somehow makes sense to distinguish two very different claims. I mean, one claim concerns precisely this point that, you know, from the first moment of experience, you know, the infant is certainly together with others, and it couldn't survive if it was not supported by others from the very start. I mean, I don't think anybody would kind of dispute that. The question is whether phenomenal consciousness or experience itself is somehow constitutively dependent upon others. I think that is the kind of theoretically interesting claim, and I have to say again that I've never seen a convincing argument, at least in my eyes, that could defend that claim. So again, I mean, you know, it's a little bit, you know, like saying, so of course, I mean, the child would of course die if it was not supported by others. But I mean, is it the very socially supporting environment that somehow imbues the child with experience? I mean, I think that's the relevant claim, and I don't think anybody has a good account of how that argument what it should look like.
Yeah, I mean, it brings to mind, I suppose, Sartre's kind of discussion of the look and how reflexive self-awareness is awakened through interactions with others, and he talks about that sort of practically, but also ontologically, how it's a kind of ontological relation, that the self is kind of awakened by the other. And but when you're talking about experience, you're not necessarily talking about reflexive self-conscious experience.
No, of course, and I think, I mean, it's kind of funny that you bring it up, because I think well, it's not so long ago that I actually heard somebody make the case that Sartre should precisely be someone who thought that self-consciousness were socially mediated. And of course, I don't think this is true, because it's a very specific kind of self-consciousness that Sartre thinks comes about as a result of being looked at by others. And of course, he's also very well known for having advocated the notion of pre-reflexive self-consciousness, that for him is part and parcel of consciousness per se. And he certainly doesn't argue that pre-reflective self-consciousness is brought about as a result of experiencing yourself being viewed by others. So I think, again, one has to distinguish different levels and different types of self-consciousness. And I have absolutely no problem, you know, accepting that there are lots of very important, very significant forms of both self-consciousness and levels of selfhood that are socially mediated and enabled. I mean, my concern is just about whether it goes all the way down. And of course, I mean, and this would be the other side. It's just assumed that was the case. I think my concern would be that this is, of course, suddenly, you know, throwing something else into the debate. You know, what about the otherness of the other? I mean, if all of us were co-constituted and intertwined and codependent from the very start, I mean, I don't think it wouldn't only put pressure on the role of the subject. I also think it would put pressure on the role of the other, and I basically want both. I want both the self and the other, and I think it's on the basis of those two notions that we can get a proper, rich conception of the we, which is very different from, say, you know, some kind of undifferentiated, fused, I don't know what. Yeah.
And kind of, when you were talking there, it made me think of Levinas's account of alterity and the absolute otherness, and he was inspired by Buber, which you mentioned in the article that you wrote for the philosopher, the I-thou relationship or the second person relationship. And can you say a little bit more about why that's significant in your conception of how we form the we?
Sure. I mean, so I think that I mean one way to pick up the question would be in the following way. I mean, if we want to understand the we, it's not enough just to try to think about the relationship between the I and the we, because being part of a we or a we always involves more members than just myself. I mean, it also involves other members, and whether or not I qualify as a member of that we is not just up to me. I think this is in the nature of we-ness, so to speak, that it involves some kind of recognition or acknowledgement by the other members as well. So one way to kind of develop that thought is to say, well, if we want to understand what a we is, we also need to look at the relationship between the prospective members. We need to understand how we come to understand others in the first place. I mean, had we no, interpersonal understanding, had we no form of social cognition, I mean, I think it would be very hard to make sense of the notion of we. Mm-hmm. And the moment we say that, then of course the relevant question is whether all forms of interpersonal understanding is equally relevant and significant. And I mean, one question one could ask would be, if I am addressing the other member of the group as a he or she, and she does the same thing to me, that is, if both of us are kind of engaging with the other from a third person perspective, is that what we need in order to be able to constitute a we together with somebody else? Or might the second person that is relating to the other as a you perhaps have a special significance? And I mean, I think my basic idea would be that that constituting a we with somebody else is very importantly relating to somebody else as a co-subject rather than merely as, so to speak, a mental object or an entity with a mind. I mean, I mean, again, a we is a first person plural. It's about sharing subjectivity with others in a certain sense. And I think that the idea would be that relating to another as a you is really a way of highlighting or emphasizing precisely the co-subject status of the other, because relating to another as a you is precisely to relate to somebody who is simultaneously relating to me, taking me as his or her you. So there's a kind, again, what I'm trying to say is that there's a certain I don't know, highlighting of the subjectivity of the other the moment one relates to the other as a you, and I think that is crucial in order to kind of get a we off the ground.
But because I was thinking of lots of different examples. Obviously, the concept of the we is applicable in so many different realms, like the we of the nation state, and the we that I form with my partner when we talk about our family is very different from the we when I say, all the people that I grew up with that I don't know personally. And in those cases, I'm not forming a second person relationship. And I mean, it seems like there has to be quite a great deal of differentiation between different types of we, different types of group membership for this account to be
absolutely robust. Yeah, and I mean, I agree completely. And I think, I mean, one way to put it is to say that we have to recognize that a we can come with very different durations and very different sizes. And as you say, I mean, you might be able to constitute a short-lived we with your dancing partner, and that's of course is a very different we than the we than the kind of transgenerational we that you participate in via your national membership. So of course there are there's a lot of differences here, and again I think that one of the problems with some of the the kind of very influential discussions of collective intentionality is that the main focus has really been on kind of very simple action types. How do we decide to go for a walk together? How do we make food together? How do we paint a house together? And I'm not saying that those kind of joint actions are not important, but I think, they might not even touch upon the types of we that are kind of politically most important. So I think we need differentiation. And I guess coming back to the relevance of the you relation, I guess at least for me, interesting question is then, the moment we have made these differences, it's of course also important to try to understand how they relate systematically to one another. So, what is the relationship between, say, the we that I constitute with, past generations vis-a-vis the we that I constitute in dyadic face-to-face relations? And here I think not so surprising point would be that there is a certain dependency relation, in the sense that I really don't think it would be possible to take on this more anonymous kind of larger scale we, had it not been because we also had the possibility of developing kind of more more embodied face-to-face types of we. So I think that the dyadic we strikes me as being a plausible candidate for a precondition for the more anonymous one, and I think this is where I would want to insert the you relation.
No, and I completely agree with that, and I've been giving that some thought, again going back to early infancy and child development, having just had a baby a couple of years ago and through the process of early infancy with that child, and thinking about how experiences of belonging, because I think belonging is obviously very related to this, experiences of belonging that we have with social groups or nation states or political groups or other formations or communities are grounded on that kind of primary intercorporeal relationship with a caregiver. So the sense of belonging that creates a coherent sense of belonging to others. And it completely makes sense to me that then the dyadic relationship, the I-thou relationship, would then ground a more diffuse sense of we. But going back to the I-thou, for Buber, it was a kind of relationship that was a sort of spiritual connection with the other that gave one's life meaning. And then for Levinas, he took the face-to-face relationship as a kind of moment or introduction to ethics. So grounding ethics ontologically in experience with a face-to-face encounter with the other. So it seems like for those thinkers, certainly grounding something significant in the I-thou or the you relationship brings in this ethical impulse, which I suppose is important if you're thinking about groups like political parties or nation states. And is the ethics of the we coming into your project or your work at the moment as well?
I was a little bit worried that you would ask that question. Because I have to, I have to admit that it's not really my main. What do we care? It's a little bit outside my comfort zone to talk about those issues, because it's not something I have worked so much on. I have to admit. So I guess one way to reformulate your question, and which is also a question that I have occasionally gotten, and actually saying that makes it a little bit embarrassing, because given the fact that I've received the question so many times, also have provoked me into thinking a little bit more about it. But the question would be this: whether they are kind of normatively different we's. Are there we's that are better than others? We's that we should encourage. Are there certain types of we's that should be more encouraged than other types of we's? And I think the only thing I can kind of say off the top of my head would be that and I think this would actually be in line with what Buber would be saying, that for him a proper we is really one that recognizes and preserves the individuality of its members, and which allows these members to flourish as individuals, rather than a we that seeks to suppress I mean, I call a kind of more totalitarian we that seems to that wants to kind of uniform and uniform its members. I mean, you know, that might be perhaps one way to think about which types of we's are more should be. Yeah.
And I was thinking as you're talking there about the affective atmosphere of a we. So if a we encourages an affective atmosphere that's about acceptance and love and recognition and respect, as opposed to maybe more negative affects like distrust and shame and disgust, and, you know, keeping the group together because they're bound by a negative self-experience and a negative group experience.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, picking up at that, I mean, because another question that often also comes up is whether we can only be constituted by processes of exclusion. I mean, can a we only be a we if it demarcates itself vis-a-vis those who are not part of it? And I think my own view would be no, because I think again there are many different types of we, and I mean you might think of very simple cases. So just take, you know, the dancing case again. I mean, assume that you are just two people alone in a house. I mean, you can dance together. You can have a certain experience of being a we with your dancing partner. And I don't think that presupposes you know, a simultaneous exclusion of others. Mm-hmm. But of course, I do think that there might be, you know, if we're talking about much more enduring we's, much more consolidated we's, I'm sure there are lots of very interesting kind of structural features that go on, power structures that goes on, and where the contrast to competing groups might help consolidate, you know, the we identity. And then, of course, one could ask again this question of whether, I mean, a kind of more enduring we that is primarily defined and held together by animosity vis-a-vis outsiders. I mean, whether that is a we should encourage the you know, persistence of, or whether there might not be ways of securing the endurance of the we that somehow allowed for more openness and tolerance.
Yeah, and I think the kind of question of in groups and out groups is obviously really relevant.
Oh, of course.
And I mean, I think in the example that you gave of you know, a pair dancing alone, I suppose there might not be an out group, but there is a differentiation in that we, so it's we and not them, right? But then once the sense of we grows into something more diffuse, it does seem like the differentiation can quickly become a distinction marked by normative parameters. So we are somehow better, we are somehow different, or we are, you know, we can mark ourselves out in this way. Sure. And that propensity to in-out group behavior seems obviously to characterize human behavior in, you know. So I wanted one last thing before we open it up to questions. So Anthony mentioned that I wrote an article for the last issue of The Philosopher, and it was about intercorporeality and social distancing, and thinking about how the alienated intercorporeal communication that sort of characterizes social distancing, how we kind of skirt around each other in the street, and you know, well, nowadays we were wearing face masks all the time, we don't come into physical proximity, how that is changing the kind of atmosphere of our social relations, but also how that's affecting possibly like our ethical relations, our sense of self, our sense of self-worth, and so on. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about these social distancing conditions and how they are impacting on the sense of we.
Yeah, no, I do, but I think I would perhaps highlight another feature that you didn't explicitly mention, because think about Zoom or Skype or all the online communication forms that we are currently using, and I think, I mean, most of us would probably agree that it doesn't really, it can't replace the real thing, you know, and I think it has kind of made me think of two things. One is, you know, that there has been a lot of, and I've even mentioned the term face-to-face encounter already in our conversation. And you could, of course, say, you know, Zoom should be an excellent example of a face-to-face relationship. but perhaps what many people have meant when they talked about a face-to-face relationship was actually not, these floating faces completely decoupled from the rest of the body. So I really think that, the notion of intercorporeality actually, in a better way than the face-to-face notion, captures what is important. And I think one of the things that we are missing so much in Zoom, which I also think is very important for the constitution of a we, is perhaps, let me just mention two things. One is, of course, that even though we have some kind of it might not even be an optimal eye-to-eye contact, but even though we have that, there's one thing we do not have, and that is, of course, a shared environment. And I think what normally characterizes proper intercorporal encounters, of course, that we do that. We are not free-floating subjects, but we are engaging and interacting in a shared environment that, to a large extent, also helps us understand one another. And I think that is one thing that is really missing in Zoom and Skype meetings. The other thing is that often when we meet on Zoom and Skype, there's typically a very kind of structured agenda. And I think what we don't find, and what I think is also very important for promoting, a sense of community, is all this unstructured, just being together with one another that do characterize normal social interaction. So I think this way of kind of, having these very compressed meetings with a lot of bullet points that one has to rush through is again not the best format for allowing the development of a real community.
Yeah, and I think, just to finish before we open for questions, one thing that's always struck me when I come to Copenhagen is the sense of community you have in your center, where every single day everyone sits down and has lunch together and has these informal encounters and chats and gets to know one another. And compared to where I work, where, that's never happened and may never happen. We all eat at our desks or don't have the time or have competing schedules. And I think structuring that sense of community into a workplace is so important. And that's precisely what we're missing in these sorts of interactions. Thank you. So I'll open it up to Anthony to, hey.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that. So yeah, there's definitely some questions coming in. I'll start. Gustav Sigurd Bjornsson has addressed questions to both Dan and Luna. So maybe we could start with Luna to bring her into the discussion. So Gustav asks, is affective atmosphere in the we relationship infused with power dynamics, or can we think it in more neutral terms?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. I think it probably depends. I think if you have an affective atmosphere in relationship, a we relationship of equals, the power dynamics might not be so prominent, but I think it must just depend on the configuration of the we who is there. But I think thinking about power, and this comes back to what we were discussing about in groups and out groups and differentiating a we from another, and that differentiation of in and out groups is usually coupled to differential distributions of power. So one group ends up being more socially powerful or superior or higher up the hierarchy than the other. So I think that's an interesting, and I haven't thought it through, but I think that's a really interesting thing to think about through the idea of an affective atmosphere. I don't know if Dan has any other thoughts.
Yeah, I think on that question, I think I would agree with you. I don't think that affective atmosphere necessarily are structured by power relations, but it's certainly easy to consider cases where they are. So I think, again, one would have to differentiate different scenarios.
Yeah, so this is the question from Gustav to Dan. Do you think we or I-thou formation is something bound to a specific developmental stage in children? Do we have we relationships with non-human animals, say our dogs, for example?
Okay, but isn't that actually two different questions? Because one question is whether you can only have a we relation with other human beings. And I think I would deny that. I mean, I think one case I thought of was, what if you are what is it called, a jockey? Is that a term? You know, if you're riding a racehorse and you're competing in a race. And I mean, I don't think, I mean, it's not really something I've ever done myself, but I could somehow imagine that if you are doing that, I mean, there's a certain joint action going on that would somehow allow us to talk about that couple constituting a we. So I don't think I'm not a speciesist here, but I didn't fully understand the other part of the question. I mean, because of course I wouldn't want to say that it's only at a certain early stage of development where these things are. I think they develop throughout our life.
Yeah, I think I may have read two questions as one because they were next to each other. So yeah, the first question would be, do you think we or I-thou formation is something bound to a specific developmental stage in children? So
no, I don't think so. I think the only thing I would say about that is that I think that what developmental psychology teaches us is that that the we is a latecomer. I mean, evidence for the child actually being able to constitute a we with others, say having in-group biases, engaging in ostracism, is something that I think, as far as I know, happens around 3 to 4 years of age. And I don't have any, qualms about ascribing both self-experience and other experience much earlier. So I think in development, I think the we is a latecomer, but the moment it's there, I think it will start influencing both self-experience and other experience throughout the rest of our lives.
Okay, so there's a question from Katie, which says the primacy of we is often motivated by a critique of individualism. Where do you stand? I guess this could be for both of you on the question of individualism. Is obviously arguing for the fact that we isn't primary, isn't at the same time an endorsement of, say, a Cartesianism or something like that. So where would you stand on that question?
Should I go?
Well,
first?
Yeah, you go first. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I do think that I mean, if individualism is taken to mean, the idea that one should valorize, individual preferences, that it's about, it's about also maximizing the individual's quality of life. Of course, I don't think that has anything to do with the view I would be defending. I mean, so again, I mean, perhaps to use slightly different terms. I mean, one thing is egoism, another is kind of defending an ecological view of consciousness. I mean, saying that consciousness necessarily is subject-centered, and of course, saying that has nothing to do with kind of defending the view that it's just about maximizing one's own, preference. So I really think, I mean, so there's a certain metaphysical discussion about, what is the nature of consciousness, and I think that has to be separated from a discussion about, an ethical discussion about what values should we pursue and what is important in life. I think those two things are not, they don't overlap.
Yes, so this seems to link in with a question from Manisha Biswas, which I think I'll put to Luna, because I feel like this touched on some of the things you were discussing in the essay you wrote. And so I suppose it's again about this idea of dependence on others. And the question is, are the mental disturbances experienced as part of forced isolation, e.g. in prisons, an example of how phenomenal consciousness is constitutively dependent on others?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because there has been some contemporary phenomenological research looking at solitary confinement, like Lisa Gunter's work, and Sean Gallagher's written some work as well, and thinking about how the sense of self and phenomenal experiences sort of disintegrate in prolonged periods of solitary confinement, and one's experience comes to be characterized, I guess, by psychopathology. Rather, the sense of reality breaks down, one's own sense of experience breaks down, and so the argument then is made that we need to be constituted continuously through intercorporeal encounters with others and meaningful social relations with others, in order to have an enduring and coherent sense of I that's not, overridden by what we would consider psychopathology. So I mean, it's definitely a position that I'm very favorable towards, thinking about our embodied dependency on others and our intercorporeal relations that I think constitute our lives from early infancy all the way through. We can isolate ourselves for prolonged periods, but there's still something about how we were constituted through caring relations with others through infancy and onwards that is significant, I think.
Dan, would you like to pick up on the mutual constitution thesis?
Yeah, no, I would. I mean, so I think I would want to distinguish two different claims. I mean, or perhaps even more. I mean, so first of all, I think it's very important to distinguish kind of externally enforced social isolation from voluntarily chosen social isolation. And I remember reading a case of a Buddhist nun who spent 3 years alone in a cave in the Himalaya as part of her spiritual practice. And I mean, she subsequently said that this was, one of the richest experiences she had ever had, and she wanted to return and do it again. So I just think, I think social isolation can actually mean a lot of different things. That's one point. The other perhaps more important point is that I think we have to distinguish between the idea that sociality can influence the content of our experience, and can also, help us become psychologically robust individuals. We have to distinguish that claim from, I think, the more radical and, in my view, also wrong claim that deprived of social interaction, we wouldn't have experiences, and we would basically be some kind of non-conscious zombies. Unfortunately, I think there are people who defend that view, but I don't know of any empirical evidence that supports that. So I'm not saying that social interaction and, caring relations are not super important, but I just think that the right place to situate their significance is not by considering them, a necessary condition for experience per se. I think we have to look at their importance in a somewhat different, somewhere else.
But I think that kind of brings the question of experience. So if we think of experience as a kind of minimal condition of just having experiences, as opposed to having a qualitative understanding of what constitutes a coherent experience, or an experience that can be integrated in oneself, an identity, or an experience that is actually enriching rather than diminishing. So there's so many layers of to consider, right?
Sure,
and I
sure.
think, and I think your point is really good, because also with I presume the Buddhist nun who took herself off for 3 years had a series of practices that she was engaging with that kept, trained her mind, trained her body, and so on, which is quite different, quite a different endeavor, right? Engaging in a practice of self-transformation.
Sure,
Mm-hmm.
sure. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question from Michael Babbage, who's actually the former editor of the Philosopher and the Wittgenstein Scholar. So, he touches on normativity, which I don't know, Dan, if you suggested that wasn't really your sort of primary thing. But anyway, I'll put it to you first, and then Luna may be able to pick up on the thread. So Michael asks, your line of thought seems to lead to the primacy of the second person, not the first person plural. then a problem seems to be how personal interactions can be more than exercises of power and can lead to the normative relations that social life requires. So I don't know if you...
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, so of course, I mean, if I understood the first part of the question correctly, I mean, then I would give primacy to the second person singular over the first person plural. That is true, but I don't see why standing in a second person relationship would necessarily involve kind of normatively problematic power relations. I mean, I don't fully understand that, because I think, you know, one example of a second person in engagement, which I really think involves some kind of reciprocity, would be a communicative exchange where, you know, people are talking together, and as a result of that communication, I mean, they're actually exploring a topic jointly. And I mean, I think Merleau-Ponty has written beautifully about this, basically saying that as a result of this communication, the other kind of allows thoughts to emerge in ourselves that we didn't know we had, and vice versa. So that's really something new that emerges out of this joint kind of communication, and I don't see why. So I mean, why not kind of look at the positive part of the I-DAO relation, which of course is also what, say, Buber would say. So I don't really, I don't see why focusing on the I-DAO relation would necessarily somehow be an obstacle to allowing for a kind of positive normative relation. I mean, but perhaps I just didn't understand the question.
Well, maybe Michael can write a kind of clarification. I mean, I suppose when you think about, say, the Sartrean view of second, that sort of seems like a classic example of where any kind of positive social norms potentially break down. But I agree that if you look at Buber's I-Thou, that seems like a very, you know, normatively reliable way of interacting. So maybe Michael can write a response. There's a really interesting question that's come in from Catherine Fisher, and it relates to the question of animals. So if we consider some human, non-human relationships a we, is that just a way of anthropomorphizing these non-human beings? I think if we accept some discomfort with this, maybe because we cannot properly ask, for example, our dog about its experience, this opens up something interesting about the experience of the we. Is it possible I experience something as a we, but the other, who is constitutive of me having a we experience, may not experience a we? So I don't know if one of you wants to jump in more to that question.
Well, at least I have one immediate response, and then perhaps Luna can take over, because I think you know, one of the things I was saying earlier was that I think it's very important not to view the we as this kind of fused unity, that a we is always something that preserves plurality and difference. And I think one outcome of that is that a we is also potentially fragile. It's something that has to be negotiated over and over again. And I think and the fact that, and that was also something that came up in our conversation, the fact that I cannot, by the very nature of the we, solely decide whether I'm a member, but that it also requires the acknowledgement and recognition of the other. Of course, precisely, I mean, I think it pinpoints this problem that just me having a we experience is actually not sufficient, because I can be mistaken, and I think that is regrettably the fact of life. I mean, we can sometimes think that we are part of a group and then realize that actually, you know, the others never recognized us as proper members. But I think, I mean, but rather than just looking at that as a flaw, I mean, and perhaps this is also pointing to kind of richness of the we. I mean, that it is again a fragile phenomenon, but that's precisely what also makes it valuable. I mean, at least that would be my take on it. But Luna, perhaps you.
No, I was just thinking when you gave the example of I can't remember what the example was you gave, but I was thinking about a guide dog. So for someone who's sight impaired and relies on a guide dog to navigate the streets and navigate their way around the world, that really does seem like a collective intentionality, right? Like the two entities are perceiving together. And it does seem to me like it makes sense to talk about a we in that position. And I was thinking when you were speaking that I think the other sort of misrecognition can happen where you are ascribed to a group. So, you know, you might belong to a club or you have that club membership, but you don't feel that you are part of that group at all. In fact, you're not recognized by anyone in the group, but from the outside, you're ascribed to that group. And so I guess the kind of sense of being part of having group membership or being part of a collective can be misrecognized by others as well.
Yeah, but I also think if I can just add to that, I mean that I think here it's also very important to be clear that that we have to distinguish the we, which I think is a very peculiar social formation, from other types of groups. And I mean, as you just pointed out, I mean, there are certain groups that we are basically members of, regardless of whether we care about it, and we might even be members of these groups without our knowledge. And I mean, one example that I think I also mentioned in the article was, you know, what about being, you know, member of the people with blood group O? I mean, again, you are a member of that if you have that blood type, regardless of whether you know about it or not. But I just don't think that those types of group memberships, which can completely kind of surpasses or ignores the first person perspective, I don't think those are appropriate candidates for you know, we groups. I think a we group is really one that involves and requires this identification and participation. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay, so I guess this will probably have to be one, if not the final question, and it's from Gareth Williams, and he asks, is the question of primacy an empirical matter, and if not, how is it to be constituted or shown? I don't know if either of you feel inspired to answer that question.
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, I guess my view would be that it's actually not, it's not an empirical question, and I also think if one looks empirically at it, yeah, well, I mean, that's perhaps a little bit contradictory what I'm saying now. Let me just rephrase. Because yeah, I mean, it's a little bit a hard question, because on the one hand, I would want to say that developmental psychology, for instance, can clarify and illuminate many of these questions. So in that sense, I wouldn't want to say this is a philosophical question exclusively, and we don't really need to consider anything else. On the other hand, I also do think that that it's not merely an empirical question, and I think we also have to recognize that developmental psychologists who are working on these matters are, of course, informed by a lot of theoretical considerations, and I guess so the reason why I don't want to say that it's only an empirical question is, of course, because I think if we start thinking about what it actually means to be a we, I think we have to realize that it is something that involves plurality, and for that very reason, I don't think it makes any sense to propose that the we is something that gives rise to and precedes, you know, the existence of individuals. I mean, I just can't get my head around that. There might be, you know, so another way of putting it is to say, you know, you might perhaps defend the view that there's something that precedes the existence of individuals, but I would then say whatever that then might be, you know, calling it a we is definitely a category mistake. Yeah, so I don't know whether I'm trying to have my cake and eat it at the same time. So, but I somehow think that both sides of what I was saying was right. So I guess I need to think more about whether there is some kind of contradiction here or not.
Okay, so there's one final question, which is a short one, and I think it will allow both of you to kind of answer it in a pithy way, and it may well have already been done, but it's from Jean-Francois Jacques, and he asks, isn't the we just a hypothetical state in between I and other in their respective subjectivities, which may be seen as the common sense understanding of we? So Luna, do you have a pithy answer to that question about the status of the we as something more than just a hypothetical state in between I and other in their respective subjectivities?
I'm not sure I fully understand that formulation, but I think that the we has to be something quite real, because we can enact, we not only do we have like collective attention, but we can do things together and make decisions together and enact things together and do activities together. So it seems like it has a bit more motive force than a kind of hypothetical state, but I might not have understood the wording there. So it does seem something very concrete and experienced, and that's intersubjectively constituted in the world. And like, to go back to the previous question about whether it's an empirical question, I think the only answer to that is that it's both, that we can investigate this question, the primacy of the we, empirically, but that empirical investigation needs the scaffolding of philosophical thought as well in order to make sense of the findings, right? So I think it can't be one or the other, but has to be both.
Yeah. And so if I was, I think I basically would agree with Luna. I mean, I'm also a bit uncomfortable talking about the we as something hypothetical, because I also think it's very real and actually makes up a very, very important part of social life. And what I kind of like about the question, though, was this idea that the we somehow located in the in-between. I mean, I think there might be something important there, but I also think it's important to understand that participating in a we doesn't leave the I unchanged. I mean, because that could also be one way of interpreting the question. If there are these I's, and then they might have certain relations, but they kind of remain whatever they are, regardless of whether or not they have the relations to one another. And I don't think that would be the right view. I think the moment you start participating in group formations, the moment you are part of a we, I think it starts enriching and affecting your self-experience, your engagement with the world, and your understanding of others. So it is also a kind of part of a scaffolding process that changes a lot of things. And I guess that also is why I think it would be wrong to just talk of it as something hypothetical.
That was a very good summary to end the event on. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Luna. It was a great conversation. Thank you for the questions, and apologies as ever to those whose questions were not asked. I was asked whether the chat function can be saved, and I'm not sure if it can. I'll have to probably check the settings for future events, but I'll leave the webinar on for another 10 minutes or so. So if there's any links you want to check, you're very welcome to do so. A reminder that you're very much welcome to consider purchasing a copy of the new issue with Dan's lead article. And obviously, if you wanted to also purchase the previous one on bodies, which features Luna's super piece on intercorporeality and social distancing, that would be great. So thank you both very much. Thanks to everyone attending. We're back on Monday with a conversation between Tom Stern of University College London and Paul Katsafanas of Boston University on Nietzsche's ethics. So hope you all enjoy the weekend, whatever you're doing, whether you're locked down or able to roam around. So thank you, and thanks to both of you again. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.